Have you ever sat down to eat and wondered, just for a moment, how far back this goes? Not the recipe, not the kitchen, not even the crop that produced the food on your plate, but the deeper question, the one that hums somewhere beneath conscious thought. What were human hands reaching for before any of this existed? Before the field, before the flame, before the word for hunger had even formed in a human throat? Picture a landscape that no longer quite exists, a world of open grasslands stretching to the curve of the horizon, broken here and there by rivers that have long since changed its course, forests that have been swallowed by farmland, and scarce so clean they were invisible against themselves. The world was not empty. It was astonishingly full of life, of texture, of possibility. And somewhere in it, one particular kind of animal was learning very slowly to make the most of everything it found. What did that animal eat? What did hunger feel like when there was no pantry to open, no market to visit, no field to harvest, no fire to reliably call your own? What flavours shaped the chemistry of the very body you carry right now? And what does it mean that we have wandered so far from that original table, and that our bodies still remember it? If this kind of slow, deep journey through human origins helps you rest a little easier, you might consider subscribing to this channel. It's a small gesture, but it genuinely keeps these nighttime voyages going, and quietly reassures the algorithm that you enjoy wandering through forgotten worlds. And if you're still awake for a moment, leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from. I read those comments like scattered embers on a dark hillside, each one marking another sleepy traveller settling in somewhere across the world. Take a slow breath in and let it fall away. Feel the quiet around you deepen, the way evening silence once fell across a landscape without cities, without roads, without the smell of anything synthetic on the air. Make yourself comfortable wherever you are, and let the edges of your day begin to blur. Now, let's drift backward. A long way backward, past every recipe ever written, past every farm ever ploughed, past every fire ever coaxed deliberately into life. Let's step gently into the deep human past, into the hundreds of thousands of years before dinner had a name. Before a single word of history can be spoken, there is a body. Yours. And somewhere inside it, written not in language, but in chemistry, in enzyme and receptor and craving, is a record that stretches back further than any written account, further than any archaeological site, further than the oldest cooking fire anyone has ever found. You're not simply a person eating food, you are a biological system shaped over millions of years by exactly what was available, what was hard to get, and what, when found, made the difference between surviving the night and not. The preferences you feel, the pull toward fat, toward sweetness, toward the particular satisfaction of salt, these are not arbitrary. They are ancient. They are instructions. And tonight, very slowly, we are going to learn to read them. Think about that for a moment. Not as a curiosity, but as something deeply, quietly true about the experience of being alive in a human body. Every time you reach for something rich and calorie-dense, every time the smell of something cooking over heat produces a feeling that is almost involuntary in its warmth, you are not simply responding to the present moment. You are responding to something written into you across an almost incomprehensible stretch of time. The human lineage, depending on where you draw the line, is somewhere between 4 and 7 million years old. Agriculture, the practice of deliberately planting and harvesting crops that now feeds nearly every person on Earth, is perhaps 12,000 years old. That means that for the overwhelming majority of human evolutionary history, there were no fields, no granaries, no markets, no supply chains, no preserved food beyond what the season itself provided. For nearly all of the time that anything resembling a human has walked this earth, the question of what to eat was answered the same way every day, by going out into the landscape and finding it. Your body remembers this, not consciously, not in any way you can access with deliberate thought, but at the level of physiology, in the architecture of your digestive system, in the specific enzymes your body produces, in the way your metabolism responds to abundance and scarcity, in the particular chemicals your brain releases when you encounter certain combinations of taste and texture. The past is still present, quietly, continuously, with a kind of patient biological insistence. There is something both humbling and strangely comforting about this idea. The body you are resting in right now is not a modern design. It is an ancient one, updated around the edges, but fundamentally shaped by conditions that no longer exist. It was built for a world of intermittent abundance and reliable scarcity, a world of long walks and physical effort, of seasonal variation and dietary diversity, of foods eaten close to where they grew, processed minimally, consumed with the particular appreciation that comes only from having worked to obtain them. And here is the thing that the science of paleoanthropology, of ancient isotope analysis, of dental microwear and coprolite examination, which is, with admirable commitment, the study of ancient preserved waste. Here is what all of it, when gathered together, quietly suggests. There was no single way that ancient humans ate. There was no one perfect ancestral diet waiting to be recovered and followed. There was, instead, a breathtaking variety of strategies, all of them working, all of them shaped by the particular landscape and climate that a given population called home. But beneath that variety there were patterns, there were consistencies, there were foods that appear, again and again, across sites separated by thousands of miles and tens of thousands of years. And those patterns, those repetitions, those ancient emphases, they are still echoing very softly in the body you are settling into rest tonight. Let's start with what we do know and begin at the very beginning. The story of what humans ate does not begin with humans. It begins with something much older, much quieter, and almost impossible to imagine standing where we now stand. It begins with the dietary legacy of creatures who walked before us, distant ancestors measured not in thousands but in millions of years, who were, when the fossil record first finds them, not hunters at all, but foragers moving through canopied forest, reaching for fruit and leaves and insects, with hands that looked, in certain lights, almost familiar. To understand the Stone Age diet, you have to understand that it had a prologue, a long, slow evolutionary preface written in tropical forest and open savanna by creatures who were, in every meaningful sense, feeling their way toward us. Imagine for a moment a world without a single human footprint in it. It is somewhere between 4 and 6 million years ago, and the eastern edge of Africa is changing. The great forest that had blanketed much of the continent is fragmenting, pulled apart by shifting climate and the slow geological drama of the Rift Valley opening beneath it. In the pockets of forest that remain, small-body, upright walking creatures move through the canopy and along the forest floor. They are not quite apes, not quite humans. They are something in between, something that evolution has not yet resolved into a final form, and they are eating, primarily fruit, sweet, ripe, calorie-dense fruit, the kind that grows in abundance during certain seasons in tropical forest, the kind whose sweetness is a reliable signal that energy is available, that the body should consume now, consume eagerly, while the consuming is good. They are also eating leaves, young and soft and high in protein in their early growth stage. They are eating insects, termites, ants, beetle larvae, plucked with careful fingers from bark and soil. They are eating whatever the forest offers, and the forest, in its dense and layered generosity, offers quite a lot. This is your dietary inheritance, at its most distant and foundational level. The preference for sweetness that you carry is not a modern indulgence. It is a 4 million year old signal preserved through every generation of evolution that followed, because for most of that time it pointed reliably toward food that was good to eat. The ability to digest fruit sugars efficiently, the particular pleasure of fat, the specific satisfaction of protein after a period of exertion. These are old feelings inherited from ancestors who had no language to describe them and no reason to question them. They worked, and so they persisted, but then the forest thinned, and everything that followed depended on what those small-bodied, fruit-eating creatures were willing or compelled to try next. Think about that transition, not as a line in a textbook, but as an experience. One generation living in forest, the next finding the forest edge closer, the next finding grassland where trees had been, the foods that had always been available becoming harder to find. New foods present but unfamiliar, requiring new knowledge, new courage, new patience to learn and to use. This is where the story of the human diet truly begins. Not with a discovery, not with an invention, but with a slow generational willingness to eat something different, to reach for something unknown, to try. And from that willingness, patient, experimental, almost imperceptibly gradual, everything that we will talk about tonight eventually grew. Around 2.5 million years ago, something changed. The forests thinned, the climate shifted, and the great canopied world that had shaped the dietary habits of our ancestors began to open up into something broader, drier, and far more demanding. You're standing now at the edge of what would one day be called the African savanna, though it had no name yet, only an aching, windswept quality of endlessness. The grass stretches away from you in every direction, broken by the dark line of a distant tree line and the silver glitter of a shallow seasonal river. This landscape, to the creatures moving across it, was not a paradise. It was a problem, and the solution to that problem would quietly reshape every meal that followed for the next 2 million years. The problem was not simply one of distance or exposure, though both were real. It was a problem of food type. The forest, for all its difficulties, had offered food that was relatively easy to recognise and consume. Fruit was obvious, leaves were accessible, insects were abundant, but the open savanna offered something different, something more varied, more seasonal, more demanding of knowledge and effort to obtain. The grasses themselves were largely inedible, without significant processing. The large herbivores that grazed them were faster, stronger, and far better armed than the small-bodied hominins crossing between tree lines. The seasonal waterholes drew prey animals and predators alike, making proximity to water a matter of constant risk calculation. And yet the savanna was, in a very real sense, the most nutrient-rich landscape those early hominins had ever encountered. The large-bodied animals that moved across it represented enormous concentrations of protein and fat. The underground plant foods, roots, tubers, bulbs, were present in quantities that the forest floor had never offered. Even the seasonal grasses, inedible in their raw form, produced seeds that could, with effort and experimentation, be processed into something useful. The question was not whether the food was there. The question was whether a relatively slow, relatively small-bodied, relatively defencelessly armed creature could find ways to access it. And the answer, developed over hundreds of thousands of years of trial and error and incremental learning, was a slow and cautious yes. You can feel the scale of this transition if you sit with it for a moment. It is not the dramatic, sudden leap that retrospective storytelling tends to suggest. It is gradual. It is multi-generational. It is the accumulated result of countless small experiments, most of which failed, some of which worked just enough to be tried again, and a very few of which changed something fundamental. A group of early hominins follows vultures to a carcass left by lions and discovers that the marrow inside the bones, reached with a rock, is extraordinary in its caloric density. They return. They remember. The knowledge spreads. Several generations later, following of vultures to carcass sites is a practiced behaviour, not an accident. That is how the open table of Africa was learned. Not through genius or invention, but through patience, observation, and the particular kind of intelligence that could hold a memory, share it with others, and build upon it across time. You are the inheritor of every one of those small experiments. Every cautious bite, every repeated return, every accumulated piece of knowledge about what this landscape offered, it is somewhere in the deep architecture of you, quiet and ancient and still, in its own way, running. If you were to sit down and examine what the earliest members of the genus Homo were actually consuming, not in theory, not in legend, but as recorded in dental wear patterns, in fossilized plant residues embedded in ancient teeth, in stable isotopes preserved in bone, the picture that emerges is both surprising and strangely familiar. It is not the image of a noble hunter striding across the plains with a spear. It is messier than that, more opportunistic, more patient, more humble. The oldest menu was not written with any particular ambition. It was written by necessity, by the shape of the land, by what the season allowed, and by what a bipedal, relatively slow, relatively unarmed animal could actually get its hands on before something large arrived to take it. What the isotope evidence tells us, an isotope analysis of ancient bone is one of the most powerful tools available to paleoanthropologists studying ancient diet, is that early Homo species were consuming a mixture of plant and animal food with a carbon signature that shifted significantly from the earlier, more forest-adapted species that preceded them. There was more grass, more underground plant material, and more animal protein, though whether that protein came primarily from active hunting or from the scavenging of carcasses killed by other predators is a question that the evidence has not yet settled cleanly. The dental record adds texture to this picture. The teeth of early Homo habilis and related species show wear patterns consistent with a varied diet. Hard objects processed alongside softer ones, gritty plant material alongside cleaner food sources. There is no single dominant wear signature, no clear signal of specialization in any one food type. What there is, consistently across multiple early Homo species in multiple sites, is variety. Think about what that variety actually meant on the ground in a lived daily experience. There was no planning in the modern sense. There was no meal prepared in advance for later consumption. No ingredients assembled and combined according to a recipe. There was a landscape, and there was knowledge of that landscape. Accumulated, shared, refined across generations, and there was a constant low-level reading of it. What is ripe? Where the water is? Where the herds have moved? Which plants are edible at this stage of their growth, and which are not yet? You move through this world with a digging stick and a sharp stone. You stop at a termite mound and spend an hour carefully extracting the protein-rich insects within. You notice near the base of a particular tree the leaf signature of a tuber-producing plant and dig until you find the swollen root below. You pass a fig tree heavy with ripe fruit and eat until the urgent sweetness of it becomes something close to satisfaction. And then, late in the afternoon, you smell something carried on the wind, something that every instinct in you recognizes before any conscious thought has formed. The smell of a large animal carcass, relatively fresh, not yet fully claimed, and you make a calculation as you have been making it every day of your life about whether to approach, how quickly, and with what. This was the oldest menu, not curated, not optimized, not particularly romantic in its daily details, but extraordinary in its flexibility, in its breadth, in the sheer metabolic and cognitive demands it placed on the creatures who navigated it. A menu that required, in its daily practice, more knowledge, more skill, and more active intelligence than almost any modern dietary system has ever asked of the people following it. There is a kind of forensic poetry to the study of ancient teeth. Each scratch, each pit, each microscopic groove worn into the enamel over years of chewing is a record of a life, of specific textures encountered again and again, of foods that were hard, foods that were gritty, foods that required extended processing before anything useful could be swallowed. When paleoanthropologists examine the dental microwear of early Homo species under a scanning electron microscope, they are reading a diary, one written not in words, but in wear. And the diary, when read carefully, tells a story that resists easy summary. These were not specialists. They were not committed to any single food source. They were, in the most literal sense of the word, omnivores, creatures whose teeth tell a story of constant improvisation. You're carrying a version of those same teeth right now, modified by millions of years of subsequent evolution, reduced somewhat in size and robustness as the diet shifted toward cooked and processed food, but structurally recognizable as belonging to the same generalist tradition. The flat grinding surfaces of the molars, built for processing plant material. The sharper cutting edges of the front teeth, suited for biting through tougher food. The canines, reduced in comparison to our earlier primate relatives, suggesting a diminished reliance on tearing raw meat with the teeth alone. Human teeth are a compromise. They are not the best teeth for any one task. They are adequate teeth for many tasks, and that adequacy, that carefully engineered versatility, is the signature of a dietary generalist shaped across deep time, to be capable of surviving on whatever was available. But the hands tell an equally important story. The human hand is one of the most remarkable biological structures in the natural world, not because of its strength, which is modest compared to many other primates, but because of its precision. the opposition of the thumb and fingers that allows for an extraordinary fineness of grip, the sensitivity of the fingertips, dense with nerve endings, capable of detecting textures and temperatures with remarkable discrimination. These are, in part, hands shaped for eating, for the careful extraction of insects from narrow passages in wood and soil, for the delicate separation of edible parts from inedible ones, for the manipulation of a digging stick, a stone tool, a cracked bone. Hold your own hand up for a moment if you're still awake enough to do so, and look at it with that in mind. The thumb that can meet every finger, the fingertips capable of picking up something as small as a grain. This is a tool shaped by millions of years of dietary problem solving. It is, in its own quiet way, a cooking utensil older than any kitchen. The combination of hands and teeth tells us something important that pure dietary reconstructions can sometimes obscure. Early humans did not simply eat what was in front of them. They processed what was in front of them. They used their hands to access food that the teeth alone could not manage. They used tools, initially just conveniently shaped rocks and sticks, to extend the reach of those hands into food sources that would otherwise have been unavailable. And this processing, this gap between the raw material that the landscape offered and the modified form in which it was actually consumed, is one of the defining features of the human dietary story from its very earliest chapters. Long before fire, long before pottery, long before anything that might be recognised as a kitchen, the human relationship with food was already shaped by the uniquely human capacity to change what was found before eating it. That capacity, running from the very first deliberately struck stone flake to the most complex contemporary kitchen, is unbroken, ancient, and still, in the quiet of this evening yours, beneath the surface of the African savanna in dry and difficult soil, grows something that early humans may owe more to than almost any other food on Earth. The underground storage organ, the tuber, the corm, the bulb, sits below the reach of most animals, invisible from above, protected from fire, resistant to drought, and quietly packed with carbohydrates. Some researchers believe that the shift to a more ground-based diet, coinciding with a period of significant climate drying, brought early Homo populations into profound and prolonged contact with these buried foods. You would not have found them by accident. Finding them required knowledge, the knowledge of where to look, what signs to read on the surface, which plants marked the presence of something edible below. It required a digging stick and the patience to use it. The tuber hypothesis, as it is sometimes called in paleoanthropological literature, proposes that underground storage organs may have been a critical fallback food during the lean seasons and lean years that punctuated the African savanna environment. When fruit was scarce, when game was mobile and difficult to approach, when the grasses had dried and the seasonal plant foods had retreated, the tubers remained. They were always there, below the surface, patient and calorie-dense and essentially indestructible by drought. Think about what it would mean to know this. To carry as a piece of practical ecological knowledge passed from one generation to the next. The understanding that when the surface of the land appears to offer nothing, the land beneath it still holds food. That a particular arrangement of leaves, a certain dry stalk poking above the grass at the end of the dry season, marks a place where digging will be rewarded. This knowledge, low in drama, high in survival value, may have been among the most important intellectual assets any early hominid group possessed. These starchy tubers of sub-Saharan Africa, studied by researchers looking for clues to ancestral diet, are remarkable foods, dense in complex carbohydrates, requiring cooking to reach their full digestibility, which is interesting in itself, suggesting that tuber consumption and fire use may have become linked quite early in hominin dietary history, each making the other more valuable. Some researchers have proposed that cooking tubers, which dramatically increases their caloric availability compared to eating them raw, may have been one of the earliest and most significant applications of controlled fire. Not meat roasted over flame, but a starchy root, buried in embers, transformed by heat into something the body could use with extraordinary efficiency. There is something almost meditative about the image of this. A fire burning low at the end of the day, a group of early humans settled around it. Not in a house, not in anything with walls, but in the simple shelter of proximity and warmth, and in the embers slowly softening the food that made it possible to stay in this difficult, beautiful, demanding landscape through another dry season. The modern potato, the sweet potato, the yam, all of these are, in their own domesticated way, inheritors of that ancient relationship between human hands, digging sticks, and the hidden reserves of the earth. When you eat a bowl of something warm and starchy on a cold evening and feel a deep, almost animal comfort in it, you're touching something very old, a satisfaction written into the body across hundreds of thousands of years of its own particular kind of abundance, found underground, patiently, in seasons that had very little else to offer. The image of early humans as dedicated, skilled hunters is one of the most persistent stories we tell about ourselves. It has a certain satisfying clarity to it, the lone figure against the horizon, the pursuit, the kill, the triumphant return. But the archaeological evidence, examined without the narrative overlay, tells a somewhat different story for much of the early Stone Age. For long stretches of human prehistory, meat was not hunted so much as found. Scavenging, moving through the Estiva landscape in the wake of larger predators, or watching for the circling of vultures, listening for the distant clamour of a kill, then descending on the carcass with stone tools before the lions had finished, was likely as important as any active pursuit. You were not the apex predator. Not yet. You were something smarter, more patient, and considerably more flexible. The archaeological signature of early meat-eating is not clean. Cut marks on bones made by stone tools, sometimes overlay tooth marks from carnivores, suggesting that hominins arrived at a carcass after other predators had already fed. Sometimes the pattern is reversed, suggesting that hominins got there first and carnivores arrived later. The picture is one of competition and opportunity, of a landscape in which multiple species were vying for access to the same high-value food, and in which early Homo was one competitor among many, not the dominant one perhaps, but a remarkably persistent and creative one. There is a kind of humility in this that the more heroic versions of the hunting narrative tend to skip over. Early meat-eating required not strength or speed, but something more unusual. The willingness to approach large predators and their kills, to read the landscape for signs of recent death, to move quickly and efficiently once a carcass was located, to extract the maximum caloric value before the competition arrived or returned. It required courage of a specific and unglamorous kind. Not the courage of the chase, but the courage of the arrival, stepping into a place where something large had recently died, in a landscape where large things that had not recently died were never very far away. Stone tools changed this calculation significantly. With a sharp stone flake, a hominin could process a carcass far more quickly than any competitor without tools. The skin, too thick for bare hands or teeth to breach efficiently, yielded to a worked edge in seconds. The meat could be removed from the bone rapidly, carried away from the site, consumed elsewhere. The competitive advantage was not physical strength. It was the capacity to manufacture, carry and deploy technology, and to do so quickly enough to make the risk worthwhile. But here is what the scavenging hypothesis and the broader picture of early hominin meat-eating ultimately illuminates about the human dietary story. Meat was not the foundation. It was the supplement, the high-value, high-risk, intermittent supplement that, when it was available, represented a caloric windfall of the kind that made the difficult seasons survivable. The foundation was plant food, steady, daily, accumulated through knowledge and effort and the deep familiarity with the landscape that a settled or semi-settled group develops over generations. The hunter arrived later. The gatherer was always there. And the full picture of the Stone Age diet holds both of them, in proper proportion, without diminishing either. Around 2.5 million years ago, something appeared in the archaeological record of Eastern Africa that would alter the trajectory of the human diet more decisively than almost any other development until fire. It is not dramatic to look at. It is a rock, napped against another rock until an edge appears, sharp enough to cut, strong enough to crack, simple enough to be made in minutes. But this tool, this older one flake of struck stone, did something profound. It gave small-bodied, slow-moving, essentially weaponless creatures access to a food source that had previously been locked behind skin and bone too tough for bare hands to breach. The marrow inside the long bones of large animals dense with fat, rich with calories, became, with a stone hammerstone, suddenly reachable. And access to fat in a landscape where calories were never easy changed everything. The Oldowan tool industry, named for Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania, where some of its earliest and most concentrated evidence was found, is deceptively simple in form and revolutionary in consequence. The core tools are essentially just rocks with one or more working edges. There is no fine shaping, no elegant symmetry, no obvious sign of aesthetic intent. What there is, when you look at the working edges under magnification, is evidence of use. Repeated, purposeful use. Cutting, scraping, pounding. What these tools unlocked in dietary terms is best understood by thinking about what they allowed access to that nothing before them had permitted. Skin. The outer covering of large mammals is extraordinarily tough, evolved specifically to resist penetration by the teeth and claws of predators. For a hominin without these tools, a fresh carcass represented food that could be seen and smelled but not efficiently reached. With a sharp flake, the skin could be cut. With a hammer stone, the long bones could be cracked. And inside those bones, in the cylindrical space that runs their length, was something extraordinary. Fat. Rich, dense, metabolically available fat, in quantities that the plant-dominated diet of the open savanna could rarely provide. This was not the lean protein of muscle tissue, it was something more valuable, calorie for calorie, than almost anything else the landscape offered. The brain runs on glucose, but the body, during periods of caloric scarcity, runs on fat. And access to reliable dietary fat, even intermittently, even scavenged from another predator's kill with the urgency of knowing the lions might return, represented a nutritional shift of profound evolutionary significance. Some researchers have proposed that it is precisely this access to fat and animal protein, opened by stone tools and expanded by fire, that drove the significant increase in brain volume that characterizes the transition from the earlier, smaller-brained Australopithecines to the larger-brained Homo species that followed. The brain is expensive tissue. Growing it requires sustained investment. That investment, the argument goes, was made possible by a diet that included reliable access to the high-calorie foods that stone tools unlocked. You are sitting here, in the quiet of this evening, with a brain that is the downstream consequence of a rock struck against another rock 2.5 million years ago. It is not the most romantic origin story, but it may be one of the truest ones, a reminder that the most consequential developments in the human story are not always the ones that announce themselves with grandeur. Sometimes they are small and sharp and held quietly in the hand. If there is a single food that deserves more credit than it typically receives in the story of human evolution, it may be bone marrow. You have to imagine the scene without the retrospective understanding of nutrition science, without knowing what a calorie is, without understanding fat metabolism, without any framework for what the body was actually gaining. You are simply an early hominin, cold and hungry, sitting at the edge of what remains of a large carcass. Something tells you, instinct, learned behaviour, observation of others, to pick up a heavy stone and strike the femur. It cracks, and inside, instead of more bone, there is something entirely different. Yellow-white and rich and almost shockingly dense. You eat it, and the body, which has been running low for days, notices immediately. This scene, or something very like it, is written into the fossil record across dozens of sites scattered through eastern and southern Africa. Long bones with percussion marks, patterns of cracking consistent with deliberate hammerstone use. The accumulated evidence of a behaviour that was not occasional but systematic, a practised, repeated engagement with bone marrow as a significant and valued food source. What made marrow so valuable, beyond its caloric density, was its relative accessibility compared to other high-fat foods in the savanna environment. The fat of a live animal was essentially unreachable without hunting technology that early hominins did not yet possess. But the fat inside the bones of a dead one, a carcass encountered on the landscape, already killed by a larger predator, was accessible with nothing more than a suitable rock, and the knowledge of what to do with it. There is something in the marrow story that resonates with a broader truth about how the human dietary story unfolded. It is not a story of genius or invention in the sudden dramatic sense. It is a story of noticing, of paying sufficient attention to the landscape and to cause and effect. This action produces this result. This result has this quality. This quality is worth seeking again. To gradually, generationally, build a repertoire of knowledge that transformed what the land offered into what the body needed. Modern culinary traditions around the world still reflect an awareness of bone marrow as something rich and restorative. Broths made from long simmered bones, the particular pleasure of scooping marrow from a roasted bone with a narrow spoon. These practices, some of them thousands of years old within recorded culinary history, are themselves the inheritors of something far older, a behaviour documented in the fossil record 2.5 million years before any recipe was written. Consider that continuity for a moment as you settle further into the quiet of the evening. The same basic nutritional intelligence, fat is valuable. Fat is worth the effort of extraction. Fat found inside bone is among the richest and most available kinds, running from a hominin crouching over a carcass on the African savannah, all the way forward through time to every culture that ever made stock from bones, to every tradition that ever valued the richness inside rather than the surface without. The body learned this, and the body, across all the generations that followed, did not forget. For every dramatic image of the hunt, for every cracked bone and stone flake, there is a quieter, longer, less cinematic story unfolding alongside it. The story of plant food, of berries ripening at the edge of a woodland, of seeds shaken from dry grasses into cupped hands, of leaves tested cautiously and roots pried from reluctant soil. Gathering in deep prehistory was not a passive activity, not the simple act of walking through abundance and taking what offered itself. It was skilled and knowledge-intensive labour, conducted largely by women across most forager societies we have any record of, and it almost certainly provided the majority of the calories consumed across most of the Stone Age. The hunt was real, but the harvest was constant. The knowledge required to gather effectively in a wild landscape is, to modern sensibilities, almost impossible to fully appreciate. Consider what it entails. Knowing, within a given territory that might span many square miles, which plants are edible and which are toxic, and knowing that some plants are edible at one stage of their growth and poisonous at another, that some require processing to remove bitterness or toxins before they can be safely consumed, that some are edible only at a specific time of year and only in a specific condition. Knowing where particular food plants grow, returning to those locations season after season, tracking their availability with an attentiveness that amounts to a form of ecological memory spanning years and decades. This knowledge was not written down. It could not be. It was transmitted person to person, generation to generation, in the context of shared activity. Children learned by accompanying adults on gathering expeditions, watching, imitating, tasting what they were shown, learning the names and textures and seasons and locations of every edible thing in their world. This process of transmission was itself a sophisticated technology, as sophisticated in its own way as any stone tool. It was the technology of ecological literacy. You move through a particular section of the landscape in the late dry season, and you know because your grandmother showed your mother and your mother showed you, that the small-leafed shrub at the edge of the drainage line will have swollen roots worth digging. You know which grasses at this time of year have seeds worth the effort of stripping from the stalk and processing. You know that the fruit on this particular tree is not yet ripe, but the one 50 paces away is, and you know the difference by the colour, by the slight softening when pressed, by a smell so subtle that only years of attention have taught you to read it. This is gathering. Not passive, not simple, not the romantic image of walking through abundance and picking what presents itself. It is active, intelligent, experienced reading of a landscape that has been known intimately across multiple lifetimes. The caloric contribution of plant foods in the Stone Age diet varied enormously by latitude and season. Higher in tropical and subtropical environments where plant productivity was year-round, lower in temperate and northern environments where winters stripped the landscape bare. But across most of the African environments where the human lineage developed, and across most of the Holocene forager societies that have been studied directly, plant foods provided the reliable caloric base on which everything else was built. The hunt supplemented it. The gathered plant sustained it. As you lie here in the quiet, think of the extraordinary patience embedded in that knowledge system, the slow, accumulative, generational building of understanding about a landscape that took lifetimes to acquire. There is a stillness in it that feels, in this particular moment, very close. Here are segments 11 to 20, each expanded to approximately 600 words, maintaining the second-person present tense, sleep-friendly rhythm and sleepy time history wasi atmospheric tone. No single development in the story of the human diet compares to what happened when our ancestors gained reliable, repeated, intentional control over fire. The exact timing remains a matter of ongoing scientific debate, with compelling evidence scattered across sites in South Africa, East Africa, and the Levant. But at some point, perhaps as long ago as 1 million years, perhaps more recently, something changed around the evening hours in hominin life. Food began to be cooked. And cooking, it turns out, is not merely a cultural preference, it is a biological event. Heat breaks down tough plant fibres that the digestive system cannot efficiently process raw. It denatures proteins in meat, making them dramatically easier to absorb. It destroys pathogens, it softens, it transforms. And the result, more calories available per bite, is now thought by some researchers to have contributed directly to the expansion of the human brain. Think about what fire meant before it was used for food. It meant warmth in cold nights. It meant light in darkness. It meant a boundary, however imperfect, between the occupied space and the creatures moving through the dark beyond it. Fire was already, in those senses, one of the most significant tools in the hominin repertoire, but the moment food was introduced to it deliberately, repeatedly as a practice rather than an accident, its significance deepened into something almost impossible to overstate. The biologist Richard Wrangham has argued, in research that remains both influential and contested, that cooking is not simply a cultural refinement layered on top of an already complete human biology. He proposes instead that the human body was shaped by cooking, that the reduction in gut size, the reduction in tooth size, the expansion of the brain, all of which characterise the transition to Homo erectus around 1.8 million years ago, are consistent with a body adapting to a cooked diet rather than a raw one. The gut is expensive tissue, metabolically speaking. A shorter gut is a cheaper gut to run, and it becomes viable when the food entering it has already been partially broken down by heat. The calories saved by running a smaller gut could, the argument goes, be redirected to the brain. Whether or not this specific timeline holds as the evidence continues to accumulate, the broader principle is now widely accepted. Cooking changed the nutritional landscape of the human diet in ways that reverberate through biology, through social structure, through the organisation of time itself. A cooked meal takes time to prepare. That preparation creates a focal point, the fire, the food, the gathering around it, that may have shaped the social structures of early human groups in ways that foraging alone never quite did. You're sitting around a fire that has been burning, in one form or another, for the entirety of human history. Not literally. But the meal you ate today, whatever form it took, was almost certainly cooked. The flavour you associate with cooked food, the browning, the deepening of taste that heat produces through the Maillard reaction, is a flavour your body has been learning to associate with nourishment across hundreds of thousands of years. The smell of something cooking does not merely signal that food is ready. At some deep biological level, it signals that calories are incoming, that the body's chemistry should prepare to receive them. There is something quietly extraordinary about that, about the way an ancient relationship between a species and a chemical process has become in code so deeply that it feels from the inside simply like hunger, simply like home, simply like the particular comfort of warmth and the smell of something good in the quiet of an evening that has been going on, in one form or another, for longer than the mind can comfortably hold. The human brain is, by any reasonable measure, one of the most energetically expensive organs in the known biological world. In a resting adult, it consumes somewhere between 20 and 25% of the body's total caloric budget, while accounting for only about 2% of body weight. This extraordinary metabolic demand did not emerge for free. It was paid for by the diet. The expansion of the hominin brain across the past 2 million years, from the modest volumes of early Australopithecus to the extraordinary architecture of anatomically modern humans, required a sustained and reliable caloric surplus, particularly of fats and high-quality animal protein. Understanding what humans ate in deep prehistory is therefore not merely culinary curiosity. It is, in a very real sense, the question of how we became capable of asking the question. The numbers are worth sitting with for a moment. The brain of an early Australopithecine, the group of species that preceded the genus Homo, had a cranial capacity of roughly 400 to 500 cubic centimetres. A modern human brain averages around 1,350 cubic centimetres, more than 3 times the volume. This expansion didn't happen quickly, and it didn't happen cheaply. Each incremental increase in brain size represented an incremental increase in the daily caloric cost of simply existing. A bigger brain required more food, reliably, every day, throughout a lifetime. This creates what biologists call an evolutionary constraint. A trait that is metabolically expensive cannot persist unless it confers advantages that outweigh its costs. The expanding human brain was paying for itself in better navigation of complex social environments, in improved planning and problem solving, in the accumulation and transmission of knowledge, in the capacity to use and improve technology. But all of those cognitive advantages were downstream of a more fundamental question. Was there enough food to run this increasingly costly machine? The dietary answer was, gradually, yes, but only because the diet was changing. The shift toward higher quality foods, enabled by stone tools, by scavenging, and eventually hunting, by the cooking of starchy plant foods to increase their caloric availability, provided the metabolic foundation on which the expanding brain could be sustained. The brain and the diet co-evolved, each making demands on the other, each shaping the other across vast stretches of time. There is something both humbling and clarifying about understanding this. The intelligence you're using right now to follow this narration, to form images of ancient landscapes, to drift gently between wakefulness and sleep, is not a free gift. It is an investment, paid for over millions of years by the dietary choices, the foraging strategies, the tool use, and the accumulated ecological knowledge of every generation that preceded you. Every meal your ancestors found and consumed, every piece of knowledge about the landscape they built and passed on, every incremental improvement in their capacity to extract more nutrition from the world around them, all of it was a contribution to the construction of the brain you are now resting. Think of it this way, quietly, as the evening settles around you. The ancient hunger and the ancient ingenuity that it drove, the cracked bone, the dug root, the food placed carefully in embers, those are not merely historical events. They are the reason this particular night is possible. The reason a brain complex enough to find rest in a story about its own origins exists not at all. That is, in its own way, a remarkable thing to carry into sleep. By the time we reach the Middle Stone Age, roughly 300,000 to 30,000 years ago, though the boundaries shift with new discoveries, the picture of the human hunter has changed considerably from the tentative scavenger of earlier eras. The archaeological record shows something more organised, more deliberate, more coordinated. There is evidence of ambush hunting at water sources. There are accumulations of bones from large prey animals at occupied sites that suggest repeated strategic kills rather than opportunistic encounters. Hafted stone points, small, shaped, deliberately attached to wooden shafts, begin to appear, suggesting projectile technology, the ability to kill at a distance. You are becoming, slowly and in stages, something that the landscape had not encountered before. A hunter that planned. Planning is the word that matters here. The difference between opportunistic scavenging and deliberate hunting is not simply one of method or technology. It is a cognitive difference. To hunt deliberately, particularly to hunt large, fast, dangerous prey in coordinated groups, requires something that the earlier dietary strategies, as sophisticated as they were, did not demand in quite the same way. It requires the ability to hold a future scenario in mind, to imagine where an animal will be, not where it is now, to coordinate with others toward a shared goal that none of them can accomplish alone, to prepare equipment in advance for a task that has not yet begun. The hafted spear point is, in this sense, a cognitive artifact as much as a physical one. Someone made it, attached it to a shaft, and carried it, not because they were currently hunting, but because they intended to hunt. The tool is evidence of anticipation, of planning across time, of a mental architecture that could bridge the present moment and a future one in a way that required real sophistication. The prey these hunters pursued was, by modern standards, formidable. The Middle Stone Age archaeological record of southern Africa shows the remains of Cape buffalo, eland, wildebeest, and other large bovids in quantities that speak to regular and successful hunting of animals that were faster, stronger, and considerably better armed than the hunters themselves. Getting within reach of these animals required knowledge of their behaviour, their seasonal movements, their predictable responses to weather and landscape. It required patience measured in hours, sometimes days, and it required a willingness to approach something large and dangerous in the knowledge that the outcome was not guaranteed. There is a tendency, in retrospective accounts of prehistoric hunting, to focus on the dramatic moment of the kill, but the reality was, as with almost everything in the Stone Age, dominated far more by the long, patient, knowledge-intensive preparation that preceded it. Learning the animal, reading the landscape, choosing the location, and waiting. And then, in the brief and violent moment that followed all that patient preparation, applying everything that had been accumulated, the technology, the knowledge, the coordination, in a single irreversible action. You carry this legacy too, though it manifests quietly. The capacity for sustained attention toward a future goal, the ability to prepare for something that has not yet happened, the particular satisfaction of a plan well executed. These are cognitive tools forged partly in the context of the hunt, sharpened across hundreds of thousands of years of exactly this kind of deliberate, patient, forward-looking effort. They are yours now, available for entirely different purposes, running quietly beneath whatever you turn them toward, along the coastlines of southern Africa, tucked into caves that once sat at the edge of a sea that has since risen and retreated multiple times. Archaeologists have found something extraordinary. Middens, ancient piles of discarded shells, the accumulated refuse of thousands of meals stretching back over 100,000 years, the shells of mussels, limpets, and various bivalves, the bones of fish, the remnants of what appears to be a sophisticated, sustained engagement with the ocean as a food source. These coastal sites, particularly in places like Pinnacle Point and Blombos Cave in South Africa, have changed the way researchers think about the Stone Age diet. The sea, it appears, was not a barrier or a mystery. For some populations, it was a kitchen, one that offered food year-round, reliably, in quantities that could support a settled or semi-settled life. Stand, for a moment, at the edge of that ancient coastline. The sea before you is not the sea as it exists today. The shoreline was lower during much of the Pleistocene, when vast quantities of water were locked in ice sheets, and what is now underwater continental shelf was then exposed coastal plain. The cave you're standing near sits above a rocky intertidal zone, exposed at low tide as a broad platform of rock encrusted with shellfish. Mussels and limpets clustered in their thousands, fixed to the rock, requiring nothing more sophisticated than a hard object and a prying motion to collect. This is not the dramatic, dangerous, uncertain harvest of the inland hunt. This is something different, a food source that is dense, reliable, predictable, available at low tide every day, regardless of the season, and requiring relatively modest effort to access. The caloric return for the effort invested in shellfish collection is not spectacular by the standards of a successful large animal hunt, but it is consistent. Day after day, tide after tide, the intertidal zone replenishes itself. For a group with the knowledge to exploit it, the coast offered something that the interior landscape rarely could: the reliable elimination of hunger as an urgent daily problem. The nutritional profile of shellfish and other marine foods adds a further dimension to this picture. Shellfish are rich in zinc, iodine, and omega-3 fatty acids, nutrients that are relatively scarce in terrestrial plant foods, and even in much terrestrial meat. Iodine and omega-3 fatty acids, in particular, are associated with neurological development and cognitive function. Some researchers have proposed that sustained access to marine foods, with their distinctive micronutrient profile, may have played a role in the cognitive and behavioural developments that characterise anatomically modern humans. In the archaeological record, the appearance of symbolic behaviour, of personal ornamentation, of what looks, from the outside, like the beginning of something recognisable as culture. This is speculative and contested, as the most interesting ideas in paleoanthropology tend to be. But the coastal sites of southern Africa are real, and their age is real, and the evidence of sustained, sophisticated marine exploitation is real. Whatever role the sea played in shaping the cognitive and biological development of the people who lived beside it, for tens of thousands of years it clearly played one. The ocean as a table, ancient, vast, reliably set, and at its edge, the earliest evidence of what might be the most human of all dietary behaviours, returning to the same place again and again because you know what it offers and you have learned to depend on it. One of the most consistent findings to emerge from the last several decades of Stone Age dietary research is also, in some ways, the most quietly surprising. There was no single Stone Age diet. The variation was enormous. A forager group living along the southern African coast ate a diet dominated by shellfish, fish and marine mammals, supplemented by terrestrial plants. A group living in the interior of northern Europe during a cold period ate something almost unrecognisably different, dominated by large game, animal fat, and whatever plant food the brief summer could provide. A tropical forest population might have subsisted almost entirely on plant food with only occasional animal protein. The human body, shaped by millions of years of dietary generalism, was not optimised for one particular menu. It was optimised for flexibility. That flexibility is, in its own way, the answer. This finding has a particular resonance in the context of contemporary debates about nutrition and ancestral eating. There are many voices in modern dietary culture that invoke the Paleolithic as an argument for a specific way of eating, high protein, high fat, low carbohydrate, centred on animal foods. And there are other voices that invoke the same period as evidence for a primarily plant-based approach. Both camps tend to select the evidence that supports their preferred conclusion. The broader picture, assembled from sites across multiple continents and spanning hundreds of thousands of years, does not cooperate with either simplification. It is too varied, too context-dependent, too thoroughly shaped by local ecology to be reduced to a single prescription. What the full picture does show consistently is a set of shared dietary principles that transcended the enormous variation in specific food sources. Variety itself was one of them. Most well-documented forager diets included dozens or even hundreds of distinct plant and animal species across the course of a year, a nutritional breadth that virtually no industrial dietary pattern approaches. Seasonality was another. The diet changed with the landscape, providing different nutrients at different times of year in a pattern that the body had come to expect and depend upon. And the relative absence of highly processed food was universal. Everything consumed was close to its natural form, with minimal transformation between the landscape and the body. You're lying here in a world of extraordinary dietary uniformity compared to anything your Stone Age ancestors would have recognised. The food available to most people in industrialised societies comes from a remarkably small number of species, processed and modified and preserved in ways that would be unrecognisable to any forager. Wheat, corn, soy, rice, and a handful of domesticated animals provide the overwhelming majority of global calories. The hundreds of wild plant species that might have contributed to a Stone Age diet in a single region across a single year have been replaced, for most of the world's population, by a handful. Whether this matters biologically is a question that nutritional science is still in the early stages of answering. But the variety itself, the sheer ecological breadth of what the human body encountered and processed across most of its evolutionary history, is something worth holding in the mind for a moment. Not as an argument for any particular modern dietary choice. Simply as a reminder of the extraordinary range of environments the human body has passed through and the remarkable flexibility it developed in response, a flexibility that is still there, quietly, beneath all the modern simplification, still available, still waiting to be used. There is a reason certain tastes feel urgent, not simply pleasant, but urgent, the kind of feeling that makes stopping difficult, that makes the hand reach again before the mind has quite registered the decision. Salt, fat, and sweetness do not feel compelling merely by cultural conditioning. They feel compelling because for most of human history they were rare. Salt was not available in abundance in most inland environments. Fat-dense, calorie-rich animal fat was a seasonal luxury. available after a successful hunt or during the brief autumn period when animals were at their heaviest. Sweetness indicated ripe fruit, a brief seasonal phenomenon, calorie-dense and perishable, demanding to be consumed immediately and in quantity. The body learned to want these things intensely because wanting them intensely was, for hundreds of thousands of years, the right response to encountering them. The evolutionary logic here is straightforward, even if its modern consequences are complicated. A body that responded to the presence of salt with mild interest would, in a landscape where sodium was hard to find, lose sodium more quickly than it replaced it. A body that responded to fat with urgent appetite would, in a landscape where fat was rare and intermittently available, consistently outperform a body that felt indifferent to it. A body that pursued sweetness aggressively would, in a landscape where ripe fruit was available for only weeks at a time, consume more of it and store more of its energy than a body that found sweetness merely acceptable. These preferences were survival advantages, calibrated by deep time to match the specific nutritional landscape of the African savanna and the varied environments that human populations subsequently moved through. Yeah, they were, in their original context, elegant solutions to real problems. The problem, the specifically modern problem, is that the context has changed almost entirely while the preferences have not. The craving for fat that was calibrated for a landscape where fat appeared intermittently now operates in a supermarket aisle, where fat is ubiquitous, cheap, and present in virtually every processed product. The urgent pursuit of sweetness that made sense when ripe fruit was available for a few weeks a year now operates in an environment where refined sugar is dissolved into everything from bread to condiments. The preferences remain. The scarcity that gave them their survival value has, for much of the modern world, largely disappeared. This mismatch, ancient preferences running in a modern food environment for which they were never calibrated, is one of the central nutritional challenges of contemporary life. It is not a failure of willpower. It is a collision between biology and circumstance, between a system shaped over millions of years for one set of conditions and a world that has changed faster than evolution can follow. There is something almost compassionate in understanding it this way. The urgency you feel around certain foods, the difficulty of stopping, the way the appetite seems to run ahead of any conscious decision, is not a personal weakness. It is a very old instruction, written for a very different world, still running faithfully in the body you inhabit now. Faithful, diligent, and somewhat overqualified for the present situation. The ancient hunger that drove your ancestors to seek out the densest, richest, sweetest things the landscape offered is the same hunger, the same mechanism, expressing itself tonight in circumstances those ancestors could not have imagined. It did its job extraordinarily well for a very long time. The fact that the world changed faster than it could is nobody's fault, least of all yours. Of all the foods that prehistoric humans sought, few required more courage, more knowledge, or more creativity than honey. The nests of wild bees were not easy to find, not easy to approach, and emphatically not easy to rob. Yet the evidence for ancient human honey-seeking is compelling and widespread. From rock art in Spain dated to over 8,000 years ago, showing a human figure climbing to reach a nest, to ethnographic accounts of honey hunting among contemporary forager groups in Africa and Southeast Asia, that suggest the practice is far older than any painted record. Honey was not merely sweet. In a diet where refined sugar was entirely absent, it was the most intensely sweet substance on Earth. It provided energy in a form the body could use almost immediately. For the Stone Age forager, finding honey was an event worth commemorating. Among the Hadza people of Tanzania, one of the most intensively studied contemporary forager groups, whose dietary practices are often used as a window into ancestral patterns, honey is the single most highly prized food available. When asked to rank food preferences, Hadza men consistently place honey above meat, above tubers, above everything else the landscape offers. This preference is not a quirk of one particular group. It appears with remarkable consistency across forager societies on multiple continents, in every environment where bees make nests and humans have learned to find them. The knowledge required to harvest wild honey is, like so much Stone Age dietary knowledge, deep and experiential. You have to know where bees nest in your territory, in tree cavities, in rock crevices, in underground chambers. You have to be able to read the landscape for signs of nest locations, the particular behaviour of foraging bees in the late afternoon, the faint sound of a colony audible from several metres away if you know how to listen for it, the specific species of tree that bees prefer in your region at this time of year. You have to know how to manage fire using smoke to calm the colony enough to approach the comb, and you have to be willing to sustain stings in the process, accepting a certain amount of pain as the cost of what you have come for. The Hadza use a remarkable partnership to find honey, a relationship with a small bird called the Greater Honey Guide, which leads humans to bee nests and in exchange gets access to the wax and larvae left behind once the nest is opened. This relationship, documented scientifically and confirmed to involve genuine communication between human hunters and wild birds, may itself be ancient, a co-evolutionary arrangement developed over thousands of years of mutual benefit. The bird finds the nest, the human opens it. Both eat. In the honey story, as in so many corners of the Stone Age dietary record, what emerges is a picture of deep ecological integration, a knowledge of and relationship with the natural world that operated at a level of intimacy and sophistication that most modern people have no everyday equivalent for. Not just knowledge about what to eat, but active, dynamic, reciprocal relationships with the landscape and its creatures, developed over lifetimes and transmitted across generations with the same care and faithfulness as any other form of inherited wealth. The sweetness you carry a preference for tonight is the same sweetness your ancestors climbed for, endured stings for, commemorated in paint on cave walls. It has not changed. Only the climbing has been removed from the equation, and something perhaps lost with it. Long before the word fermentation existed, before chemistry could explain what was happening or why, humans were consuming fermented foods. Not by design at first, but by observation and then, gradually by intention. Fruit left in a natural container past its peak, ripeness changes. It softens, it releases liquid, it develops a sharp or bitter quality, and consuming it produces a mild and not entirely unpleasant alteration in perception. Early foragers almost certainly encountered fermented fruit, and other naturally fermented plant material many thousands of years before any deliberate brewing took place. Some researchers have proposed that the human attraction to fermented foods and to the mild intoxication that some provide may have conferred advantages in certain contexts, reduced pathogen load, social bonding, altered states that may have served ritual or psychological functions in early communities. The microbiology of fermentation was, of course, entirely invisible to the people experiencing its effects. What was visible, what was knowable through direct sensory experience and careful observation, was that certain foods, left under certain conditions, changed into something different, sometimes into something dangerous, sometimes into something better than the original, the knowledge of which transformations to encourage and which to avoid was, like all Stone Age dietary knowledge, earned gradually and maintained carefully. The consumption of fermented foods carries nutritional benefits that go beyond the calories of the original material. Fermentation breaks down anti-nutrients, compounds found naturally in many plant foods that interfere with the absorption of minerals. It produces B vitamins and other micronutrients not present in the unfermented food. It introduces beneficial microorganisms that, when consumed, interact with the gut's own microbial ecosystem in ways that support digestive health and, increasingly, appear to be linked to broader aspects of health and immune function. None of this was understood in biochemical terms by the foragers who first discovered fermented foods, but the body understood it at its own level. The foods that contained live cultures were, in a physiologically meaningful sense, beneficial, and the body, with its ancient capacity for associative learning, found them palatable. Think about fermented foods in the modern diet and the cultural ubiquity of the category becomes striking. Every food culture in the world produces fermented foods: yogurt, cheese, bread, leavened by wild yeast, fermented vegetables, fermented fish, fermented grains. The specific forms vary enormously by region and tradition, but the practice itself is universal. It is found in every part of the world where people have eaten for long enough to develop a food culture. Its universality is itself a kind of evidence. suggesting that the encounter with fermentation and the development of methods to produce and preserve it has happened independently in multiple places across an enormous span of time. The earliest direct archaeological evidence for deliberate fermentation, for intentional brewing, dates to around 13,000 years ago in the Nastufian culture of the Levant, where large stone mortars appear to have been used for processing grain in ways consistent with beer production. But the casual, opportunistic consumption of naturally fermented foods almost certainly predates this by a very large margin, by tens or perhaps hundreds of thousands of years. By the length of time it takes for a piece of fallen fruit to begin to ferment in the shade of a tree, noticed by a passing forager, tasted with cautious curiosity, and found, despite its sharpness, or perhaps because of it, to be something worth returning to. In reconstructing the Stone Age diet, there is a category of eater that receives far less attention than the hunters and gatherers of popular imagination: children. Specifically, very young children, in the long years between weaning and full dietary independence. What did a Stone Age toddler eat when adult food was too tough, too raw, too fibrous, or too dangerous to process without adult assistance? The evidence here is partial but suggestive. Premastication, the practice of an adult chewing food to a soft consistency before transferring it to an infant, has been documented in traditional forager societies and is widely assumed to have been common in deep prehistory. Plant foods that were soft, easily mashed, or could be processed with minimal technology, tubers, soft fruits, cooked roots, likely formed a large part of the early childhood diet. A Stone Age childhood was, nutritionally speaking, a negotiation between what the landscape offered and what small bodies could actually handle. The transition from breast milk to solid food in a Stone Age environment was not a gradual introduction of pureed vegetables from a glass jar, managed according to a schedule provided by a paediatrician. It was something more organic, more contingent, and in its own way more responsive to the individual child's development and the specific resources available to the group at any given time. Breast milk, rich in fat and immunologically active, provided the primary nutrition for the first years of life, but solid food introduction, likely beginning somewhere between 6 months and a year in most forager populations, based on comparative data from contemporary societies, involved whatever soft, accessible, safe food the group had available. Premastication, the practice of an adult softening food by chewing before giving it to an infant, is well documented in ethnographic accounts of forager societies. It is also, when you think about it from a nutritional perspective, more sophisticated than it might initially appear. The adult's saliva contains amylase, an enzyme that begins the digestion of starches. A pre-masticated piece of cooked tuber or root transferred from adult to infant has already begun to be broken down, not just mechanically softened, but partially chemically pre-digested. It is, in a very modest sense, a form of food processing, ancient, intimate, and entirely adequate to its purpose. The isotope evidence from ancient human remains does offer some window into early childhood diet. Specifically, the period of weaning can sometimes be read in the chemical signature of teeth, which formed during childhood and preserve the dietary record of those years and their mineral structure. What this evidence shows across multiple populations and periods is that weaning was typically a gradual extended process, often continuing until the child was 2 to 4 years old, and that the transition to an adult diet was slow and staged. The gut of a small child is not the gut of an adult. Its digestive capacity, its microbial ecosystem, its tolerance for the range of foods an adult can process are all still developing. The Stone Age diet for children was of necessity gentler, softer, more plant-centered than the full adult range, easing toward the dietary diversity of adult life as the body slowly became capable of handling it. There is something quietly tender in this picture that the more heroic versions of prehistoric life tend to overlook. In every forager group that ever existed, adults were modifying their behaviour, their food choices, their daily labour to accommodate the particular needs of the young. The child's dietary world was a shared responsibility, not just of parents but of the broader group, because in a forager society, the survival of children was not simply a private matter. It was the future of the community, carried forward one small body at a time. There is something that modern food culture has largely erased, and that the Stone Age body was built entirely around: the experience of seasons. not seasons as a decorative backdrop to life. Not the mild preference for certain flavours in certain months, but the genuine, physiological, sometimes desperate reality of seasonal food availability. Summer and autumn in most environments provided a relative abundance: fruit, seeds, insects, juvenile animals, the full yield of a productive landscape. But winter, in temperate regions particularly, was a different matter entirely. Food stores were not a reliable institution. Fat accumulated during the good months served as metabolic insulation during the lean ones. A body that could store calories efficiently, that could down-regulate its metabolic demands when food was scarce, was a body that survived to the following spring. You were, in a very real sense, built to binge. The seasonal rhythm of the Stone Age diet was not simply a matter of what was available. It was a physiological cycle matched by the body's own metabolic responses to abundance and scarcity that shaped everything from appetite to activity level to sleep patterns. In the autumn abundance, the body ate more, stored more, built the fat reserves that would be metabolized during the winter months. In the lean spring, before the landscape had fully renewed itself, the body drew on those reserves, running leaner, perhaps moving less, conserving what it had. This is not simply a description of ancient human behaviour. It is, in a very direct sense, a description of systems that are still running in you. The particular intensity of appetite in the autumn months, documented across many human populations and often described as a craving for calorie-dense foods in the weeks before the cold, is thought by some researchers to be a vestigial seasonal signal, a metabolic preparation for a winter scarcity that, for most people in industrialised societies, never actually arrives. The body prepares for a famine that does not come, stores resources that are never drawn upon, and the cycle of autumn appetite becomes one of the more puzzling recurring experiences of modern life. Beyond fat storage, the seasonal dimension of the Stone Age diet had a profound impact on micronutrient intake. Vitamin D, synthesized in the skin through sun exposure, was abundant in summer and scarce in winter across temperate latitudes. The fatty acids abundant in the oily fish available in coastal environments offered a partial substitute. Another reason why marine food access may have been nutritionally critical for populations living at higher latitudes. Vitamin C, available through fresh plant food in spring and summer, became scarce in the northern winter, and the skeletal evidence of vitamin C deficiency, scurvy, appears in archaeological populations that relied heavily on stored and dried food during the cold months. The body navigated these seasonal fluctuations not by suffering them passively, but by adapting to them actively, shifting dietary emphasis with the landscape, utilising stored body fat during lean periods, seeking out the specific micronutrients that each season's food offered, and compensating for the ones it lacked, through whatever the landscape provided as a substitute. As the quiet of this evening settles around you, and your own body begins its nightly process of repair and restoration, there is something worth noticing in the simple fact of rest itself. Sleep was, in a seasonal metabolism, a form of conservation. The long dark nights of winter, in a landscape with little food and little reason to be active, were met by a body that could slow itself, lower its temperature slightly, reduce its caloric demands, draw gently on its reserves. What you are doing now, in other words, is ancient, practiced, deeply familiar to the body in ways that go well beyond personal habit. You're doing what the body was built to do when the day is done and the dark is long, and the world outside has, for the moment, nothing more to offer. Here are the final 5 segments, each expanded to approximately 600 words, maintaining the second-person present tense as sleep-friendly rhythm and sleepy time history of a peak atmospheric tone. There is a food source consumed by an estimated 2 billion people on Earth today, documented across hundreds of traditional cultures on every inhabited continent, demonstrably high in protein, fat, and micronutrients, and almost certainly consumed by early humans for as long as the genus has existed. It is, by global measure, neither exotic nor unusual, but in the particular cultural context of post-industrial Western food systems, it tends to produce a strong and immediate aversion. Insects. The consumption of insects, entomophagy, in the clinical language of nutrition science, is not a fringe behaviour in the story of human eating. It is, in all probability, one of its oldest and most reliable chapters. Termite mounds, ant colonies, beetle larvae, caterpillars in their seasonal abundance, these were not emergency rations. For early forager populations in tropical and subtropical environments, they were a staple. The nutritional profile of insects is, when examined without the cultural filter, genuinely impressive. Many edible insect species provide protein content comparable to lean beef on a dry weight basis. They are rich in iron, zinc, and B vitamins. The larvae of many species have fat contents that provide meaningful caloric density, and they are, in the environments where they are most abundant, available in quantities that no comparable terrestrial food source can easily match. A single termite mound can contain millions of individuals. During the seasonal emergence of winged termites, a brief, predictable event that forager communities across sub-Saharan Africa still harvest intensively, the caloric windfall available per unit of effort is extraordinary. Think about what this meant in the context of a Stone Age landscape. Meat from large animals was high value but uncertain, dependent on the success of a hunt that might fail, on the chance encounter with a carcass that might not materialize, on seasonal movements of prey, animals that could carry them beyond reach. Plant foods were reliable, but often required significant effort to process, and provided relatively modest protein. Insects occupied a different nutritional and logistical category entirely. They were small, they were numerous, they were dense in the nutrients that the diet most needed supplementing, and they could often be collected in quantity with nothing more than a container and the knowledge of where and when to look. The evidence for ancient insect consumption is difficult to preserve in the archaeological record. Insect remains do not fossilise with the reliability of bone or shell, but what evidence exists is suggestive. Coprolite analysis, the examination of fossilised human waste, has revealed insect remains in ancient human samples from multiple regions. Contemporary forager societies whose dietary practices most closely approximate ancestral patterns consume insects regularly and in significant quantities, treating them not as a curiosity but as a valued and eagerly anticipated seasonal food. There is a cultural discontinuity here that is worth acknowledging. The aversion to insect consumption that characterises much of Western food culture is not universal, is not ancient, and is not biological. It is learned, absorbed through a particular cultural history that emphasised the separation of human food from the foods of the poor, the foreign, or the uncivilised. The body itself has no innate objection. Young children, before the cultural learning has fully taken hold, often show no particular reluctance to eat insects when offered them. The aversion is acquired, and it is, in the context of the full span of human dietary history, quite recent. The Stone Age forager, moving through a landscape rich in insect life, was not overcoming an aversion. There was no aversion to overcome. There was simply food, small, numerous, seasonal, nutritionally valuable, and the accumulated knowledge of where to find it, how to collect it efficiently, and how to prepare it in the ways that made it most palatable. Another thread in the vast, varied tapestry of what the body learned to eat across the long, patient centuries before anything resembling a modern food system existed. The human digestive system is not, if you examine it with fresh eyes, the system of a pure carnivore, nor is it the system of a pure herbivore. It occupies an interesting middle position, longer than a cat's, shorter than a cow's, equipped with a versatile chemistry that can process both animal and plant protein, that can extract calories from cooked starch with notable efficiency, that retains the remnants of a microbial ecosystem shaped by tens of thousands of years of dietary variety. The gut microbiosis, the vast and incompletely understood community of bacteria and other microorganisms inhabiting the human digestive tract, appears, in traditional forager populations, to be significantly more diverse than in populations eating industrial diets. What that diversity meant for health in deep prehistory is still being studied, but its absence in modern guts is increasingly a subject of medical concern. The gut is, in a biological sense, one of the most accurate archives of dietary history available to researchers. Its structure, the relative lengths of the small and large intestine, the chemistry of its digestive secretions, the specific enzymes it produces, and in what quantities, reflects the accumulated demands of the diet across evolutionary time. And what the structure of the human gut reflects is not specialization, but adaptability. Not a commitment to any single dietary pattern, but an extraordinary readiness to process a wide range of food types, provided they fall within certain broad parameters. The amylase story is one of the more specific and well-documented examples of dietary adaptation written into human biology. Amylase is the enzyme that begins the digestion of starch, and humans produce it in the saliva, a relatively unusual arrangement among primates, most of whom produce it primarily in the pancreas. More striking still, humans carry significantly more copies of the amylase gene than other primates, and populations with long histories of starch-heavy diets tend to carry more copies than those with lower starch traditions. This is evolution in visible action, the diet shaping the genome over thousands of generations, leaving a molecular record of what was eaten often enough and long enough to constitute a meaningful selective pressure. The gut microbiome carries its own version of this record. The trillions of microorganisms that inhabit the human digestive tract are not passive passengers. They are active participants in digestion, producing enzymes that break down complex plant fibers the human body itself cannot digest, synthesizing vitamins, regulating immune function, and communicating with the brain through pathways that researchers are only beginning to map in detail. The composition of this microbial community is shaped, profoundly and continuously, by what you eat. A diet rich in diverse plant fibers supports a diverse microbiome. A diet low in fiber and high in processed foods is associated with a less diverse one. The Hadza of Tanzania, whose diet retains more features of ancestral forager eating than almost any other population that has been studied, have gut microbiomes of extraordinary diversity, containing bacterial species entirely absent from the guts of people eating Western industrial diets. Whether this diversity confers specific health advantages and what happens to health when it is lost are questions at the frontier of current research. The answers are not yet complete, but the direction of the evidence is consistent enough to suggest that the gut, built over millions of years to process an enormous variety of foods, does not thrive on monotony. You are resting now, and somewhere in the quiet of your own body, the ancient ecosystem of your gut is doing its work. Processing the day's food, maintaining its populations, running, as it has always run, the vast and mostly invisible labour of keeping you fed at the cellular level. It has been doing this in one form or another for the entire span of human existence, faithfully, continuously, in the dark. Imagine the moment, and it is a moment that almost certainly happened many times in many places before it became habit, when something edible was dropped near a natural fire or left too close to embers and then retrieved and eaten anyway. The texture was different, the flavour was different, and the ease of eating, the way the fibres had softened, the way the proteins had yielded, was dramatically, unmistakably improved. Cooking was not invented in a single location by a single genius. It was, in all likelihood, discovered and rediscovered many times across many populations before the knowledge became stable and transferable. But when it finally did stabilise, when the cooking fire became a reliable feature of hominin camp life, rather than an occasional accident, the consequences for the human diet and for the human body were profound beyond easy summary. The earliest well-accepted evidence for controlled use of fire comes from Wonderwerk Cave in South Africa, where burnt bone and plant ash have been found in deposits dated to approximately 1 million years ago. Evidence of fire use becomes more widespread and consistent in the archaeological record after this point, though the gap between occasional use of naturally occurring fire and the deliberate, reliable maintenance of a hearth is one that the record does not yet allow us to precisely locate. By 400,000 years ago, hearths are documented across multiple sites in Europe and the Middle East. By the time anatomically modern humans appear in the fossil record, the cooking fire is so fundamental a feature of human life that it is simply assumed. What happened at the first cooking fire in experiential terms was not simply the production of a better meal. It was the creation of a new kind of social space. The fire that cooked the food also provided light and warmth, drew the group toward a shared centre, and created a period of enforced relative stillness, the waiting time while food cooked that may have been, in the lives of constantly mobile foragers, genuinely novel. This is the time, some researchers have proposed, when storytelling as a sustained practice may have taken root, when the social bonds of the group were reinforced not just through shared work and shared danger, but through shared narrative, shared history, shared explanation of the world. The cooking fire is in this reading not merely a dietary innovation, it is the origin of the hearth as a social institution, the centre around which human communities organised their evenings, their relationships, their transmission of knowledge across generations. The fire that cooked the food was the same fire that lit the face of the storyteller, that kept the darkness at a comfortable distance, that marked the boundary between the ordered human world and the wild landscape beyond it. You carry the imprint of this in the particular quality of comfort that warmth and food together produce, a feeling that is deeper than simple physical satisfaction, that carries a social and emotional valence not fully explained by nutrition alone. The pleasure of a meal shared with others in a warm space, the specific comfort of a kitchen, of something cooking, of the gathering that food prepares as well as the food itself. These are ancient feelings shaped at the hearth, over hundreds of thousands of years of evenings, very much like this one. The day's work done, the food prepared, the group drawn inward toward the light, the story's beginning. The first cooking fire was the beginning of dinner as more than nutrition. It was the beginning of dinner as an event, as a ceremony, as the particular, irreplaceable human practice of gathering around warmth and food at the end of a day, and for a little while, being still. There is a point in the archaeological record, roughly 10 to 12,000 years ago in the Near East, and independently in several other regions of the world, where something changes quite abruptly in the dental record. The teeth of populations that transition from foraging to farming show, almost immediately, a distinct shift. More dental caries, cavities, caused by the dramatically increased consumption of fermentable carbohydrates from cultivated grains. More evidence of certain nutritional deficiencies, reduced stature in many cases, compared to the forager populations that preceded them. More repetitive stress injuries in the skeleton from the monotonous labour of ploughing and harvesting. The agricultural revolution, which we typically celebrate as the foundation of civilization, appears in the skeleton as something more ambiguous. A trade, complexity and stability, in exchange for the extraordinary dietary variety that the forager life at its best had provided. The teeth tell the story with particular clarity because teeth are among the most durable biological structures, resistant to the decomposition that destroys most soft tissue, and because they form during childhood and preserve the chemical and physical record of those years without subsequent modification. A cavity in an ancient tooth is not simply evidence of poor dental hygiene. It is evidence of a diet sufficiently high in fermentable carbohydrates to provide substrate for the acid-producing bacteria that cause decay. Hunter-gatherer populations whose diets were high in variety and relatively low in concentrated simple sugars and refined starches show low rates of dental caries. Early farming populations show dramatically higher rates, sometimes approaching the levels seen in modern industrial populations within just a few generations of the dietary transition. The broader skeletal picture is equally informative and equally complicated. Average stature, a reliable proxy for nutritional status during childhood, declines in most populations at the transition to agriculture, recovering only gradually over subsequent millennia as farming practices improved, animal husbandry developed, and the dietary range of agricultural communities expanded beyond the narrow focus of the initial transition. Evidence of iron deficiency anemia, readable in characteristic changes to the bone around the eye sockets, increases in early farming populations. Infection rates, visible in characteristic lesions on bone, also increase, likely a consequence of living in larger, more sedentary communities with poorer sanitation than the mobile forager groups that preceded them. None of this means that the agricultural revolution was, on balance, a mistake. The population growth that agriculture enabled, the surplus that allowed specialization, the stability that permitted the accumulation of knowledge and the construction of permanent settlements. These are genuine achievements with genuine consequences for the complexity and reach of human civilization. The world you're lying in tonight, with its cities and its sciences and its 10,000 years of accumulated written history, is the downstream consequence of the first deliberate planting of a grain crop in the Fertile Crescent. It could not exist without it. But the skeleton of the first farmers is a reminder that progress in one dimension often comes at a cost in another. The dietary variety of the forager life, the hundreds of plant species consumed across a year, the seasonal rhythms, the micronutrient richness of a diet drawn from a wild and varied landscape, was not simply primitive eating waiting to be replaced by something better. It was a nutritional system refined across millions of years, and the transition away from it was, in certain measurable biological respects, a step down before it was a step forward. The teeth of the first farmers are still in the ground, still telling this story to anyone patient enough to read it. A story not of failure or success, but of trade-offs, of the particular complexity of a species capable of transforming its own world faster than its own body can follow. You are sitting here in the quiet of a world your Paleolithic ancestors could not have imagined, with its artificial light and its temperature control, and its year-round access to foods that their bodies would have encountered, if at all, only rarely and seasonally. And yet, the body you inhabit was not designed for this world. It was designed slowly across hundreds of thousands of years for a very different one. The cravings you feel are instructions written for a landscape that no longer exists. The metabolic systems that store fat so efficiently, that respond so strongly to sweetness and salt, that seek out the caloric density of fat with such focused attention, these are not flaws, they are solutions, ancient solutions to ancient problems, running quietly beneath the surface of modern life like a river that has been covered over but not rerouted. Tonight, as the world outside goes still, that ancient body is doing what it has always done, resting, restoring, carrying you forward into another day, just as it carried your ancestors forward into theirs. The distance between you and the first members of your genus is almost impossible to hold in the mind all at once. 2.5 million years of daily eating, of seasonal hunger and seasonal abundance, of knowledge accumulated and transmitted and built upon across generations so numerous that no count could capture them. Every one of those generations woke each morning to the same fundamental task, finding enough to eat in the landscape available to them, and every one of them succeeded well enough to survive, to reproduce, to pass the accumulated biological and cultural inheritance of their lives forward to the next generation. You are the unbroken end of that chain, every link held. But here is what the science of ancient diet, for all its isotopes and microware patterns and fossilized remains, ultimately returns to the body itself, not as a historical artifact or a research subject, but as a living system still shaped by the dietary history of the species. The hunger you feel is ancient. The satisfaction of a good meal is ancient. The particular comfort of warmth and food together, the social pleasure of eating with others, the deep rest that follows adequate nourishment, these are not modern inventions. They are the inherited rewards of a system that worked across an almost unimaginable span of time, well enough to bring you here. The landscape has changed. The food has changed. The tools have changed beyond anything the first stone knappers of Old Vai could have envisioned. But the body receiving all of it, processing it, storing it, building from it the tissues and the energy that make tomorrow possible, is continuous with every body that preceded it. Shaped by the same evolutionary pressures, running the same ancient chemistry, carrying the same deep preferences, the same metabolic wisdom, the same remarkable flexibility that allowed one species of medium-sized African primate to colonize every environment on Earth and eat across all of them well enough to thrive. Tonight, as you let the day go and allow the darkness to settle in around you, your body will do what bodies have done at the end of every day for millions of years. It will slow. It will repair. It will consolidate the memories of the day and release the tensions of it. The ancient hunger will quiet. The ancient restlessness will still, and somewhere in the deep wordless intelligence of the body, the long story of how you came to be fed, tubers and marrow and honey and shellfish and the slow patient fire, will continue its quiet, faithful, uninterrupted work. You do not need to understand it to benefit from it. You never did. You only need to rest. And so we arrive, quietly, at the end of a very long journey. Not a journey across miles, but across time. Across the kind of time that has no edges you can see from where you are standing. Only a vast, soft depth that recedes further the longer you look into it. You have travelled tonight through landscapes that no longer exist. You have walked across open savannas under skies that have never been photographed. You have crouched at the edge of a fire that was lit before language existed to describe it. You have tasted, in imagination, the things your body was built to want, the sweetness of found fruit, the richness of marrow, the warmth of something cooked in embers at the end of a long and difficult day. And what all of it comes back to, when the details settle and the science fades into the background where it belongs, is something very simple. Every person who ever lived had to eat. Every morning that was ever woken began with the same quiet biological insistence. The body making its ancient case for nourishment, for continuation, for one more day. And across 2.5 million years of mornings, the answer was always found. In the ground, in the trees, in the sea, in the careful accumulated knowledge of people who knew their landscape the way you know your own name. It was always found. You are the result of every successful answer to that question, of every tuber located and every carcass reached, and every fire maintained through a cold night. By someone who understood, without being able to articulate it, that the warmth was worth protecting. That inheritance is in you now, in the body settling towards sleep, in the chemistry running its quiet repairs, in the ancient systems doing, in the dark, what they have always done. You do not need to carry the weight of all that history consciously. It carries itself. So let the old landscapes recede now. Let the fire go low. Let the long story of how you came to be here fold itself back into the silence from which it came. You are fed. You are warm. You are held, without knowing it, by the accumulated survival of everyone who came before you. Rest now. The morning will come, as it always has, and the body will know what to do. Good night.